So I think we'll make a start for tonight's lecture, which is the fourth of 17 that we have planned as a replacement for the Egypt Centre Conference, which was due to take place in just less than 2 weeks' time. Tonight's speaker, Megan, completed her undergraduate and master's at the University of Liverpool, researching assistance in childbirth and fertility figurines. She continued on the University of Liverpool as a PhD researcher, currently studying the global collections of paddle dolls in the first complete study of its type. And we were quite fortunate to welcome Megan to the Egypt Centre around about 6 months ago in order to study the paddle doll, which she's going to be speaking a little bit about tonight in part of her larger research project. She's recently received funding to carry out further research visits around Europe as well as the UK by the Egypt Exploration Society's Patron Fund. So thanks to the EES for awarding Megan that. And tonight she's going to be discussing the Egypt Centre's own paddle doll, as well as some of her own research relating to that. So thank you very much for Megan for agreeing to present tonight. And over to you.
Thanks, Ken. So hello, everyone. Before I begin, I'd obviously like to thank Ken, Sam, and of course the Egypt Centre for inviting me to speak to you tonight. And obviously, as Ken mentioned, to the EES as well, whose generous funding has really allowed me to research some of the pieces I'll be discussing with you tonight. I want to apologise if at any point my Wi-Fi does go. I'm holding out on it working tonight, but if it does, I'll just try and reconnect as soon as possible. So tonight I'll be giving you a whistle-stop tour of my research on paddle dolls, as well as a closer look on the Swanzis Egypt Centre's very own doll, which I was fortunate to research in October of last year. So to begin, what are paddle dolls? Paddle dolls is a term that we use for a group of figurines, specifically found in the 11th and 12th dynasties, occasionally extending out to the 13th dynasty. The dolls usually consist of a flat piece of wood, a paddle, which is a paddle shape, strings for beads of hair, and various types of decorations. As you can see, although these dolls share many attributes, no two appearing the same, they all feature varying combinations of shapes, decorations, motifs, states of preservation, and additional features. On this slide, I've included a sample of some of the dolls that include these variations. So going clockwise from the top left-hand corner, we have one of the most magnificent dolls from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has a very well-preserved hairpiece. Next, along top middle, we have the Manchester Museum's very own doll, seen in the famous Ramesseum group, with a very striking array of coloured diagonal checkers. And then on the top right, we can see an obscurely shaped one from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. You can see it has a very narrow torso and a rounded bottom. And next along on the bottom right, we have a doll seen in the Leiden collections, which I was very fortunate to be able to study last summer. It's a very fragile but beautiful example, which contains several sets of decoration, as you can see. And it's one of only a handful of examples that still has an intact face. I'll be showing you a few of those as we go through the talk, but that's one of about 4 or 5 we see. Bottom middle, we have another example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Don't dismiss this doll. A lot of people think it's quite a crude doll, but as you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the bottom we have 2 motifs of birds. And I think you should make a note of this black shading we see on the neck, because I'll be discussing this a little bit more in a bit. And then lastly on this slide, on the bottom left, we have the Swanzis Egypt Centre's doll, which I will again be having more to focus on in a bit. So a few more of the dolls. We have had, after looking through global collections, we believe that at the moment we've found paddle dolls in over 30 collections across 12 countries. This includes collections in the UK, so England, Scotland and Wales. Previous studies have been limited to the dolls, with many being quite misjudged. There's been a few studies, however, more recently that have been a lot more insightful, and I will be discussing these a little bit more as we go on. However, what remains about these figurines is they still have so much more to reveal to us, so many more secrets and so much more that we can get from these figurines. Again, more examples on this slide. So the top left-hand corner, we have one that I find very dissimilar to a lot of examples we see. It's from the National Museums of Scotland. And you may be able to see on this one, if I just show you again, we have this darker patch running down the middle of the doll. This is due to restoration work, but it's still a very, maybe obscure, but very fine piece. Next along in the top middle, we have a doll from the Fitzwilliam Museum. The 5 paddle dolls in this collection to me are astoundingly beautiful. The clarity of the pigment is very strong, as you can see, and has survived very well. Next along, we have actually one of the dolls that first inspired me to do this research many years ago. And it's one that's found in the Atkinson Museum, which is based in the sunny town of Southport most of the time, which is just above my home city of Liverpool. It's quite an obscure piece, and many might think it might be because of the squared off nature of the shoulders, but actually we do see this on a lot of dolls. Instead, it's actually the squared off nature of the hips that we see. That's what I find more obscure on the piece, because a lot of, well, pretty much all the figurines have got this curved bottom, this from the hips down to the bottom, so it is a very obscure piece in that way. On the bottom right, we do have an example from Sweden's Stockholm collection, and again, as I mentioned with the Manchester example, it's got this beautiful coloured checkering, not diagonal checkering this time, but still very vibrant and detailed. Bottom middle, one of my favourite dolls. It's from, again, my home city of Liverpool, the World Museum here. And even though the body seems quite plain on the piece, I think you'll agree with me that the hair itself is splendid, very voluminous, and it's made of thick linen coils. I'll be mentioning that one a little bit more in a bit as well. And then last of all, we have the bottom left doll, which is again from the Met. It's not checkering this time, but we do see this diamond patterning, which is very beautiful. So, as you can see, the decoration on paddle dolls usually consists of varying combinations of checkers, diamonds, herringbone stripes, cross and lozenge tattooing, crossover beading, necklaces and motifs of the gods Tara and Bess, which are more common. This is highlighted in Angela, I know she's in the chat, and Angela Tooley's own research on these figurines, where she researched some of the pieces in her own PhD. So as you can see below, I've included a table of these. A lot of these decorations tend to highlight the breasts, hips and pubic regions on the dolls. Even when this doesn't appear to be apparent, such as we can see it through motifs located around the genital regions, on the front and rear of the dolls, patterning stopping just below the breasts and just above the pubic regions, and many examples shaped to show the voluptuous curves of these pieces. All of the decoration on this is guided towards, guiding the viewer's attention towards these areas, so it's quite an interesting mention. So this is the Swanzis example of a paddle doll. Where does it fit into this research? So as discussed by Ken in his first 2 talks, a lot of the Egypt Centre collection came from the Henry Wellcome collection, after being stored in the Petrie Museum basement until the 1970s. The paddle doll was part of this collection and came to Swansea moving through venues and departments until it resided in its current location at the Egypt Centre. Paddle doll W769 is certainly an interesting example with features both similar and dissimilar to other examples, and obviously I'll be mentioning these. So on the front of the doll, we see this cross-hatching design, which is centered around, if you can see here, the hips of the piece and also on the torso as well. We can see a beaded necklace which extends down the front of the piece around the neck. And again, that's just round here. And we see circles of dots round this bit just above the torso, and they delineate the breast of the piece. The shape of the doll is commonly seen, and it's not a rare shaping, with its squared off shoulders, its half length arms, which extend to around the elbows, and the narrow body, which ends with a gradual curving around to the hips to create a circular and round bottom. It's almost like a spoon shape, but we do see a lot of examples of this type of shaping. The doll itself is in a very stable condition as far as I was aware, with the only apparent damage to the body being a hole seen extending from the front to the back on the left hip. So as you can see, I've got that here, and then obviously a close-up shot here as well. So this, and obviously, and we also do see cracks down the centre of the piece, but I'd like to emphasise that this is by no means an obscure example when it comes to damage. A lot of the dolls we do see have this type of damage due to changes in environment, temperature, and the general movement of the pieces throughout collections. So the top and the rear of the doll give us a further insight into the evolving state of this piece and how this may have changed over time. Here I'd like to highlight the neck of the doll. As you can see, the neck features a lot of grooves and notches. So if you see it on this bit, and obviously down the side here as well, as well as clear damage to the neck and surrounding area extending down the back of the doll. If you look closely at the neck of the piece, so around this region on the side, we can see bands of black residue, which extends down the back of the doll too. Keep this in mind because I will be discussing this a little bit more in depth later on. I mentioned before the Met piece that had the black residue, and I will explain further as we go on. So last of all, for the Swansea doll, and I think this is the most interesting feature personally. It was highlighted to me when I came down to research the piece back last October by Ken. On the left, we can see one of my images, which it kind of highlights to the location of the motif. And on the right-hand side, we do have one of Ken's own images. Thanks to Ken for providing that, which does show you a clearer view of this frog motif. So as far as I'm aware, this is the only known example of a paddle doll that contains a frog motif in any of the ones I've been researching so far across the globe. And I think it certainly highlights the importance of this piece within the Swanzis Egypt Centre collection. Motifs are definitely not uncommon on paddle dolls, and we usually do see the deities Tara and Bess, and occasionally, as I mentioned before, a figure of a bird, but this is unseen. It should not, however, be a huge surprise to see a frog on this piece, perhaps representing the goddess Heket of fertility and more particularly childbirth. Frog motifs are seen on the Middle Kingdom pieces such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art apotropaic rod seen on the bottom of the screen. So as we can see here, the rod features different animals. We've got a lion, a crocodile, and then we've got these two frog motifs either side here. We also see these motifs on other Middle Kingdom material cultures such as birthing wands, and of course the importance of the frog goddess Heket is stressed in the Three Tales of Wonder in Papyrus Westcar, a Middle Kingdom literary text, as you are probably aware, featuring the birth scene of Rudedet. Heket is said to hasten the birth of the three royal children, and if we believe paddle dolls to be fertility figurines, or more specifically figures that ensured safe rebirth into the afterlife, it would only make sense that they would contain a motif of Heket amongst other figures on the dolls. All of the features that I've mentioned on the Swansea doll can really begin to emphasise the changing condition of this piece, as well as their possible original function being placed in the tomb. We will explore this idea further as I continue to discuss the research context of paddle dolls and which pathways this research is focusing on. So unfortunately, the study of these figurines has been fraught with preconceptions and prejudices from the beginning of their discovery within funerary assemblages. American Egyptologist Herbert Winlock excavated the most notable corpus of paddle dolls from Deir el-Bahari, now displayed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He certainly did not see the dolls favourably, quoting in his written records on the excavations that they are barbarous looking things, whittled out of thin paddles of wood, gaudily painted and with great mops of hair, made of strings of little beads of black mud, ending in elongated globs. So as you can see, he did not see these pieces very favourably, and I think this has had a huge impact on resulting research and the impact on their identity within both modern research and their modern perceptions in pop culture as well. Many scholars have previously failed to take these pieces as seriously as their own other figurine counterparts, which I think is a real shame. Due to the unclear nature of these pieces, they have been interpreted in many ways in pop culture, art, and even the occult scenes. Ancient Egyptian themed parties see children making their own dolls alongside an Egyptian photo booth and tablet making. Outcomes of these creative enterprises are being very mixed, as you can see. My favourite being this one here, which mimics an example we see from the British Museum, the M6459, which is a beautiful piece. As you can see, it has an intact head. So paddle dolls are also being used as inspiration in the modern art scene, and with a Southport-based artist using the pieces as muses in her own research, their identity in this scenario is encased in a wider socio-political movement to bring women's histories to the forefront of modern culture. After speaking to this artist, it's particularly interesting to see that she sees these dolls as being in line with the Venus statues seen from the Paleolithic period, believing that they represent women as goddesses in everyday contexts. Lastly, paddle dolls are discussed alongside more modern religious rituals and practices, being used as examples or precursors to those who use puppets or magical dolls in the modern day for sympathetic magic. This is based on the view that paddle dolls, as other types of figurines from the time, were seen to contain the spirit of the doll represented, and this is discussed in more modern magical textbooks. It's certainly interesting to note how varied the approaches can be seen to exploring the identity of these dolls within a modern context, but I think a huge part of this is because previous research hasn't been too clear on what their function was, so people have interpreted them in the way they wish to. So going back to my research and looking more at the academic world of paddle dolls, I discussed before how Winlock abhorred these pieces, but he believed them to have a mixed identity of function. Primarily, he argued that, as Garsang had first suggested, singular well-worn dolls were likely to be playthings used by children. However, he believed that examples of paddle dolls found in groups that appeared as more pristine and less well-worn were more likely to act as concubine figures in the afterlife, acting to increase male virility. Other views of the function of these dolls have come forward in 21st century research undertaken by scholars such as Ellen Morris and Angela Tooley. Tooley has focused her attentions on a particular subset of paddle dolls that share markings with other types of figurines from the record. This appears to be the first direct attempt to fit these figurines into a wider context. The cross markings are found on a very limited number of dolls, being, in my view, with the ones I've looked at so far, only 2 examples of paddle doll. We do also see other types of truncated figurine with this marking. So on the right-hand side, you can see an example that I mentioned briefly before from National Museum of Scotland. You can see the 2 sacral dimples on the bottom, and then above this, the 2 cross markings that Tooley discusses in her own research. On the left-hand side, we can see the Manchester Ramesseum doll, and this is the one with the vibrant patterning, the beautiful diamond checkering and vivid coloured doll that I showed you before. When I first looked at the doll, I could only see 1 cross marking on the right-hand side, and I was unsure whether this was because the left-hand side had lost its cross marking or it was never placed. But after looking more closely and using de-stretch technology, we can see, I don't know how clear it is on screen, but we can see that the left cross marking emerges when it's been put through this technology. So I think I'm going to briefly discuss Ellen Morris's research a little bit more, because at the moment it's being applied as a universal theory. And although I do not disagree with the theory, I don't think it can be a universal one for the whole paddle doll corpus. So Ellen Morris has expressed a theory, the Kenner dancer theory, which is based upon 8 lines of evidence that tie together the iconography of the dolls to the wider iconographic picture of the Middle Kingdom in order to attempt to set up an identity of these pieces. So as you may be aware, the Kenner were essentially a troupe of dancers and musicians connected to the cult of Hathor, and a lot of the evidence is centred around this. Ellen Morris argues that these figurines could directly represent this troupe, as we do not have iconographic or even textual references to the paddle dolls in the record. Could this be because they represent a pre-existing group with their own ideologies and motifs? So these 8 lines of evidence, Morris begins by looking at location of the dolls. The collection that she focused on, the corpus she focused on, I have to stress, it's only the Azarcif dolls and the ones based close to the precinct of Dar el-Bahri. This is an area highly associated with the cult of Hathor, as you know, and the majority of the local architecture and finds show this local deity's connection to the area. In addition to this, mummies of the original Kenner troupe have been found at the site, and they share a lot of tattooing of the similar tattooing we see on the paddle dolls. With these examples, we can see a clear geographical and iconographic connection between these pieces. The demographics that Morris looks at, she argues that we do see variations in the size and even shaping of the figurines, and she suggests that perhaps because musical troupes had different characters, different aged people in the group, so children, adults, that if they did represent this musical troupe, it would only make sense that we do have larger and smaller paddle dolls. And we do see a few examples of paddle doll which are much, much smaller than other examples that are larger. Costumes. As you may be aware, if you haven't had the chance to definitely have a look at this, in the Tomb of Kennemoon, we have depictions of the Kenner dancers, and the vivid patterning seen on their costumes is extremely similar to the decoration we see on a lot of the Azarcif paddle dolls. So I mentioned before the checkering, the cross-hatching, and of course the necklaces and the tattooing too. And this obviously brings it into tattooing. Not only have the depictions of the Kenner had these tattoo representations that we see on paddle dolls, but we also have the mummies of this original troupe with the same intact tattoos as well. So there's a huge corroboration between the material culture, the iconography, and also the physical remains of this group of dancers. So the last 4 lines of evidence all relate to this Hathoric connection, and indeed their connection to the Kenner dancers within this cult. Music, obviously, we all know that if the Kenner were musicians and they were associated with the cult of Hathor, Hathor herself notably has ties with music. We do see Hathor herself on sistrums, and we also do see examples of paddle dolls that are contained within assemblages that contain ivory clappers, such as the Manchester Ramesseum doll. Genital exposure might be a bit of a weird one for some people, but Hathor notoriously revives her father Ra in mythology by exposing her genitals to her father Ra. Almost all paddle dolls have this form of anisema in their iconography. If the patterning is used to denote garments, they're always shorter at the front of the doll, therefore exposing the pubic region of the doll, whereas the decoration extends typically down the entire length of the back. So obviously the focus on this being the front of the doll. Menat necklaces, these objects are highly associated with the cult of Hathor, being used suggested to be used by priestesses of Hathor, in the same way as sistrums by rattling the beads attached to this counterpoise. It's clear that the shaping of paddle dolls actually is very likely to mimic Menat necklaces, with the narrow body, the rounded bottom, and obviously the beaded hair acting as, mimicking the rattle on this, mimicking the necklace itself, should I say. And then lastly, mirrors. Again, it has this association with Hathor. with vast amounts of mirrors being found with Hathor head shaping. It's actually really interesting to notice, something that I was quite intrigued to hear here, is that only 10 tombs in a Zarsif were found to have mirrors. Yet it's noteworthy to mention that 8 of these also contain paddle dolls, with a good correlation in the material record. So, as I mentioned before, I do endorse Ellen Morris's Kenner dancer theory. I really need to emphasise that this is only for the pieces seen from the Zarsif region, perhaps tenuously extending out to the Theban region more widely. I believe that paddle dolls seen outside of this region do not display such a strong material and display such a strong connection to these 8 lines of evidence. I don't completely discount their connection to this cult, but I think further exploration of their local ties and features need to take precedence in such a study. Although further research needs to be taken on Swanzis paddle doll, I'm still very much in the early stages of looking at this doll. I need to look back at the Wellcome Collection Institute catalogues, and obviously try and establish some sort of loose, if not accurate, provenance for this piece. But I do believe that even the Swansea example only fits 2 and tenuously 3 lines of evidence that Morris suggests. And this is actually something we see in the majority of dolls globally. So my current research is focusing on 3 aspects of paddle dolls not yet before explored in prior research. The first aspect is the changing conditions of the pieces. Looking at their original state, as well as concentrating on how this has changed and evidence for these changes. I mentioned earlier the importance of the black markings and grooves seen on the neck of Swansea W769, and this is because it indicates that the paddle doll was likely to have originally had a head. When I first came into this research, I believed that paddle doll examples seen with heads were the exception, them being the finer examples with more detail and effort put into them. However, the majority of dolls I come across in my own research display these black markings, grooves and slits for string placement, and breaks on the necks of the pieces. So I'll discuss with you a bit of perhaps the suggested manufacture process. So a doll I managed to see beginning of this year in February, and thanks to the EES's support, was one from Geneva. Now this doll on the top right hand side, as you can see, has this coiled loop which attaches all the beads of the string of hair. And this is simply attached to the stuck onto the neck, the front of the neck of the piece. I would suggest that after the circular piece was attached to this neck, the mud would have been on the British Museum example, as you can see to the left of this, would have then been pressed onto this coil to secure it into place, and then shaped into the style of a head. And then obviously these 2 beads were added for eyes to complete the decoration of the face. So many of the dolls I come into contact with can see these circular mud residues. If you look on the bottom of the screen, the 3 examples here, we can see this mud residue which is seen around the bottom of the necks, or perhaps on the neck, and also the on the top, the trunk of the neck as well. And here, just I don't know if you can see, there's the necklace here, and then above here we also see this black residue. I would suggest that not only did we have examples where this coil loop is affixed to the front of the face, but perhaps also we see examples where the coil was looped around the neck, and again a similar process of attaching a mud face would have been present. And here these slits may have been where string was placed to, you know, further secure the coil as well. So I do believe that these interesting features can all attest to perhaps a manufacture process of creating the doll by creating the hair piece, affixing this to the neck of the piece, and then also creating a face. I think it may also make quite a strong case for these objects being used against these objects being used heavily in the everyday context, as these faces do appear as extremely fragile. I mean, a lot of them haven't survived even the funerary records, so being used in everyday context seems highly unlikely. So another focus of this research is still in its very early stages, but is looking at the idea of artistic influence and relative artistic autonomy on these pieces. So we do see features that are repeated on many dolls, such as decorative features, various set shaping styles, and of course the style of beaded hair we see on many examples. However, within this we do also see artistic variations in motif and decorative depictions with different arrangements, pigments and drawing styles too. We can see here we've got 3 examples from the British Museum that all contain motifs of the figure Tara. So as you can see on this one on the left, I'll just show you there. So this appears as a different style to these 2 figurines. It's a much thicker piece, well, much thicker motif. It's got more textured ears. The snout appears a lot more rounded and the tongue extends down and out. The arm of the piece extends from the front of the doll and we can see it brandishing the knife as typical to Tara. Whereas in the 2 other examples, you can see that this is perhaps a little less textured. The snout is a very different shape. It's more pointed at the front, no extending out of the tongue. And again, we do see a difference in the leg stance, as well as the arm extending out from the side of the, well, yeah, to the front, but to the side of the piece, where it brandishes a knife. Now, interestingly, these 2 paddle dolls on the middle and right were actually found by, well, the purchase from the same collector, Reverend Greville John Chester. Although we don't know the provenance of these pieces, it does seem highly likely that they were from the same site. As you can see, the 2 dolls are very, very similar in not only in shape, but also in their decoration and the artistic characteristics of this Tara figure. Oh, apologies for that. So, also I'd like to highlight in this, I have found it really interesting recently. I've come across this example on the right hand side. We were recently having discussions on this piece on Twitter, and because this is an example from an American collector, and the figure on the bottom is suggested to be a figure of Tara as well. So as you may notice, on the doll we do see a very similar stance of the piece. So we've got this side angle, we have the figure brandishing a knife, and we'll see the tail extending down the back of the piece. But the difference of the head is, for me, it was remarkable. I believed it first when I saw it to be the head of a bird, but I've had discussions with different people online and it looks like we do see some very obscure heads on Tara and some very obscure snout shapes. And I even had it jokingly suggested that it looks like a dinosaur as well, so I'll let you dwell on that one. And then lastly, a focus in my research which ties further into this is looking at regional differences, site rebranding and personal preferences. So on the top left we see this beautiful and voluminous example of a hairpiece seen on the Liverpool World Museum's own doll, originally from the site of Beni Hassan and excavated by John Garstang in his 1902 to 1904 excavations at the site. There have been debates as to whether the hairpiece is original to the doll, due to the difference in the style of hair being linen coils, instead of the traditional plant fibres and beads that make up a lot of the other doll's hair. Also, the size of the hairpiece and the attachment in the style of a skull cap, instead of the traditional looping, has raised quite a few eyebrows in the academic world. I myself was keen to dismiss the hairpiece as not original to the doll, but a hairpiece from the Petrie Museum, as you can see next to this on the right hand side, UC 59280, did make me question this a little bit. So as you can see on this on this Petrie Museum example, we do not see a coiled loop, but we instead see a patch of fabric, not so dissimilar from the fabric skull cap seen on the Liverpool example. Could it be an example of another skull cap attachment? I mean, even if it doesn't show it to be a skull cap attachment, it's different to the coiled loopings we see on other dolls, and could suggest that perhaps other attachments were used on these figures. The idea that paddle dolls could have different attachments is strengthened by the fact that this doll actually has the traditional beaded hair. It is the hair of a paddle doll because it has this similar style, but it has got a different attachment. A further consideration and possible explanation as to why this paddle doll has this style of hairpiece on the Liverpool example can be seen on the image below this. So Garstang's book Burial Customs of Ancient Egypt has documented linen dolls seen at the site of Beni Hassan, and these are two examples. So as you can see on this left-hand example, we do have this very voluminous linen hair. The only difference I can see being these little bits of decoration on the bottom, these little circles of decoration. But as you can see, the volume of the hair, the strand detail, and also this suggested skull cap is also seen on the piece. We also see this little doll, which I've always found quite adorable, which kindly I was sent a picture by Jen Turner, as this now currently resides in the Eton portion of the Eton Myers collection. So as you can see here, we do see this linen body and these little coiled, it's not as voluminous obviously, but it's got these little coiled loops of hair too. So this opens up the possibility that either this paddle doll either was put with this hairpiece that originally did originate to a linen doll, or perhaps it could even be an example of regional rebranding, with this paddle doll mimicking hair seen of other dolls at this site too. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to prove this, but it's something I continue to look at to see if there's other examples of this, not only at Beni Hassan, but other sites too. So, and on the other side of this PowerPoint, we can see three very beautiful examples of doll. And it's actually another facet of this research, looking at differences in pigmentation at different sites, where we do see differences in pigment color, type, and execution. Although the three dolls seen only have a rough provenance suggested to be Thebes, they were sold to the British Museum from the same collector, a Joseph Sams, who was a bookseller and antiquities dealer, who visited Egypt from 1832 to 1833. The fact that these were all collected by the same antiquarian and share remarkably similar features really highlights the site-specific features that we see on these dolls. One of these features being, as you may be able to see on screen, the gold pigment, which appears to cover the entire bodies of these particular dolls, ending just before garment decorations. I have been considering the possibility that the pigmentation could be a reference to the flesh of the gods being golden, perhaps elevating these figurines to godly status. I'm yet to find other clear examples with this feature, but I'm always on the lookout. So, to end, I truly believe that wider examples seen in global collections begin to highlight a need to challenge Morris's Kenner dancer theory and its application to the entire corpus of paddle dolls. Morris puts forward a very solid argument to the functioning of these dolls, but I strongly recommend at this still very early stage in my own research that this can only really be applied to the Zarsiv region of Thebes, an area with clear historic connections. Could this be in itself an example of regional rebranding, and in the same way that we look at these Beni Hassan examples that have varied attachments and hairpieces, and the perhaps the Theban examples that we see of Joseph Sams with the varying pigmentation. My current and future research has a clear focus on the iconography represented in all of the dolls, as well as how the iconography fits into the wider figurine body of the time. That's the branch of the research that I really am beginning to look into, is looking at other Middle Kingdom figurines and other material culture, because this is something that has only loosely been done before. I do believe that their wider context needs to have more focus. This research has already managed to unearth many dolls that have not been known to the public, the academic, or even their own museum circles. And with the support of auction houses and private collectors, I am further delving into the hidden world of these incredibly fascinating figurines that may or may not have otherwise been lost to the public. So any that we can, I've recently been working with a few auction houses that they've just sold the pieces, but and they do keep the documents of these for a while, but then they would dispose of them. So I really do need to get to these pieces before that documentation is lost. So whatever the outcome of this research, really, and with much more work needed, I will leave you to decide whether you believe them to be gaudy or godly. I would like to thank Ken again, like massive thanks to him, because he's been very supportive in creating this and obviously being able to present to you tonight, and obviously the wider Egypt Centre team, and the continued support I received from the EES from their generous funds, but also their interest in my own research has been very, I've been very grateful for that, and it's been very promising. All the museum collections I work alongside, I can't name them all here, but all the ones I've been invited to have been, they've given me what I needed, and I'm very grateful for that. And obviously my department at the University of Liverpool, the Archaeology, Classics and Egyptology department, and my two supervisors who have been very supportive in this time, Stephen Snape and Professor Christopher Eyre. And obviously lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for giving up part of your Tuesday evening. I look forward to answering any questions you may have, and please let me know if there's anything you want me to go over. Before I end and pass you back to Ken, I'd also like to remind you of the Egypt Centre Support Fund. They've been doing absolutely great work. These lectures are all free, and the Egypt Centre is still providing resources online. They're not getting the usual funds they would usually get through visits and school visits and shop donations, shop sales and donations. So anything really helps. So please give that a click and donate if you can. Thank you very much.